You want to know how it all started? It wasn't some big fight or headline-worthy drama. No, it began quietly, with the kind of love so ordinary you'd think it would last forever. I was the kind of mother who skipped meals so my boy could eat, who stitched his clothes late into the night, who carried his dreams on my shoulders, and believed that someday, when he was grown, he would remember what I gave up for him. That's what I thought. That's what kept me going. But love, as I learned, doesn't always come back the way you give it. And sometimes, the very people you sacrificed everything for will be the ones to throw it back in your face. This is where my revenge story truly began. I used to think the sound of a sewing machine was the soundtrack of my life. Every evening, after long hours working part-time at the corner store, I'd sit by that rattling old machine in the living room and stitch Ethan's shirts back together, patching up knees on jeans, making sure he never went to school looking less than proud. Money was tight. Lord, money was always tight, but my boy never knew it. I made sure of that. He had new shoes when I went another year in the same worn sneakers. He had lunch money when I skipped my own meals. Every birthday, every Christmas, I found a way to make it feel magical. I'd stay up past midnight wrapping secondhand toys I cleaned up so they looked new, baking a cake from scratch, hoping the smile on his little face would erase the exhaustion in my bones. And it did. For years, it did. I told myself that's what a mother is supposed to do. Give and give until there's nothing left to give. I kept a little savings jar hidden away, not for me, but for him. Someday, I thought, he'd need it. College, a car, maybe a home of his own. I imagined the look on his face when I handed it over, the way he'd hug me, grateful, proud that his mother had been quietly planning for him all along. Sacrifice became my language. I missed church picnics because I was working overtime. I skipped buying the dress I loved in the window so Ethan could have the football cleats he begged for. I turned down an invitation from a man who wanted to take me to dinner because who would watch Ethan, who would make sure his homework was done? My dreams shrank to fit the corners of his life, and I never complained. Neighbors used to say, "Maggie, you're too soft on that boy. One day he won't see how much you did." I laughed it off, sure they were wrong. I believed the bond between mother and son was unbreakable. I believed he'd always know. I still remember one winter, the heat bill overdue, me wrapping Ethan in layers of blankets, telling him it was a fun camp night at home, pretending we were adventurers braving the cold. He giggled, never knowing his mother sat awake crying in the kitchen, fingers numb, calculating which bill to pay and which to ignore. But I didn't resent it, at least not then. What nobody tells you is that love like that, silent, endless, all-consuming, can also be the thing that blinds you. It blinded me. I thought loyalty was enough. I thought pouring myself out like water would be remembered, cherished, held sacred in his heart. When Ethan grew older, taller than me, his voice deeper, I thought the foundation we had built was strong. I imagined the day he'd say, "Mom, I see what you did for me." That moment never came. Instead, life shifted in small, almost invisible ways. He grew impatient with my calls. He rolled his eyes when I reminded him of the little things. But in those early years, I brushed it off. He's just busy, I told myself. He's just finding his way. What I didn't see, what I refused to admit, was that the scale between us was tipping. All the years of me giving, him taking, had created an imbalance so sharp it would one day cut me. Back then, though, I was still the mother who kept every school drawing in a box, who sat in the bleachers no matter how cold it was, cheering until my voice cracked. I was still the woman who put her boy's happiness above her own. And I carried this quiet pride inside me, a belief that I had done something good, something noble, something that would last forever. If you'd asked me then, I would have said my life was worth it. That even though my hair was graying, my hands calloused, my back aching from years of work, it didn't matter. I had raised a son who would carry all that love forward. But here's the truth I didn't know at the time. Sometimes all that sacrifice doesn't turn into gratitude. Sometimes it turns into entitlement. Sometimes the child you love the most grows into the very person who will wound you the deepest. I didn't see it coming. I didn't imagine that one day my love would be measured, not in hugs or phone calls, but in dollars thrown at my face like I was nothing. But that moment was still a few chapters away. For now, I was still in the dark, stitching seams, paying bills, believing my devotion was unshakable. And that is why this story hurts, because the cruelest betrayals don't come from strangers. They come from the people you built your life around. They come from the ones you thought would remember. Looking back now, I wish I had kept something for myself, a dream, a piece of joy, a corner of life untouched by his needs. But I didn't. I handed him everything. I told myself it was love. I told myself it was worth it. And maybe that's the tragedy of it all. That the greatest gift I ever gave, the years, the sweat, the hope, was also the very thing that taught him he could take without giving back. That's how this began. That's how the cracks in our story started forming. And though I didn't know it then, the day would come when all those sacrifices, all those quiet nights alone, would not just be forgotten, but denied. Distance didn't arrive with a slam door. It slid under the weather strip, sat on the couch with folded hands, and one day I realized the home I spent my life warming had gone quiet, and I was a guest in it. Welcome to look, not to stay. He started calling less, and I told myself not to take it personally. "Busy week, Mom," he said, and Sunday visits drifted until they dissolved. When he did come by, he paused in the doorway like the air inside might cling to him. He scanned the room I raised him in, dented lamp, school photos, the quilt I sewed by hand, and asked if I'd thought about clearing things out. I told him I liked my life where it sat. He said, "Minimal is cleaner." As if clean and loved were the same thing. He had a new townhouse and a new tone. He texted the address like a tracking number. Precise, bloodless, no invitation. I drove over with a lemon cake and a fern, practicing small talk at red lights. Jessica opened the door and asked me to take off my shoes because the floors were new. Of course, the baseboards gleamed. The air smelled like an ocean-scented candle. Ethan ended a call and hugged me the way you hug at an office party. Polite, brief, careful not to wrinkle anything. He toured me through rooms the color of agreement. Pale walls, pale couch, art that did not dare offend. "It's minimalist," he said. I said it was beautiful because my opinion lived on the porch. He showed me an app that closed the blinds. I showed him the cake. He set it beside a box labeled barware and asked if I'd seen their drawer organizers. We sat on the sofa as if waiting for an interview. I asked about work. He gave me acronyms instead of stories. I told him the azaleas were early. He nodded as if I'd reported a shipping delay. I mentioned the draft in my old house. He said he'd send a link for sealant, then smiled at a message that wasn't mine and forgot the link. Back home, I kept my phone face up on the table like a lighthouse for ships that had changed course. I left voicemails that sounded like postcards. "Hi, honey, I made soup. The church roof is fixed. Saw your old math teacher." I deleted most before they sent. I didn't want to be noise. One Saturday, I drove over unannounced with marinara I'd simmered all morning. Through the window, I saw them eating takeout, laughing the easy laugh of people who don't need subtitles. Ethan opened the door halfway, shoulders warm from the life behind him. "We're in the middle of something," he said. I held up the jar like a permission slip. "We're cutting carbs," he added, apologizing to my love in glass. "Freeze it," I said. "Freezer's full," he replied, final. That night, I ate pasta alone and tasted every year I had folded myself smaller so he could fill the space. The next morning, his text landed like a receipt. "Love you, Mom. Talk soon. Correct weightless." At a family dinner, he sat far away telling a story about a coworker who bought a boat. Laughter skipped over me. I waited for one of our old looks. the quick private smile that once meant home base, but his eyes never searched down the table. When I finally spoke, it was to ask if he wanted more salad. "I'm good, Mom," he said with the politeness you give the woman who hands you your dry cleaning. The word Mom had new edges. I tried to give him space. That's the advice on magnets. So I widened my smile and narrowed my needs. I let days pass without reaching for my phone. I told myself love doesn't demand, it trusts. The space grew like ivy, claiming a new brick every week. Once he called about a loan document, and for 15 minutes light poured through my chest. I read him the numbers as if I were handing over an organ. He said thanks, got a run, and the dial tone came back like a tide. I held the phone a few seconds longer, listening to the ocean that would not speak. Tell me honestly, if the person you love keeps sliding your chair a few inches from the table, do you call that growth or erasure? I asked myself that question like a prayer, hoping one answer would hurt less. You can tell me what you'd call it. Maybe your word will be kinder than mine. For Jessica's birthday, I mailed a card with a gift certificate tucked inside. "Thank you for loving Ethan," I wrote, meaning it. Weeks later, her photos showed a long table, tall candles, faces young as fruit, the caption, "Found Family." I looked so closely my eyes watered, searching the edges for any shadow where a mother might stand. All I found was good lighting. At the grocery store, the cashier asked if I needed help to the car. I almost said yes, starved for company that didn't require usefulness. Instead, I said I was fine and pushed my cart into a sky so ordinary it felt designed. That's the thing about this kind of cold. It isn't dramatic, it's efficient. It files you down until you are easy to lift, set aside, and finally forget you completely. You never think the child you raised will erase you with one sentence, but that's exactly how it happened. One sentence in a crowded restaurant, and suddenly my entire life, the years of sewing, cooking, scraping, saving, was gone, stolen right out of my hands. Not by a stranger, not by the world, but by the very boy I gave everything to. The night was supposed to be simple. Ethan had invited me to dinner with a few of his friends from work, and my heart leapt like a girl's at the thought. An invitation at last, a place at his table. I ironed my best blouse, pressed my slacks, and put on the pearl earrings my late husband gave me. I told myself this was a sign things were changing, that maybe my son had noticed the distance and wanted to close it. The restaurant was new, polished wood floors, soft lighting, music you could barely hear over the chatter. Ethan waved me over, already sitting with 3 of his colleagues, drinks in hand, the kind of people who looked like they belonged in glossy magazine ads. He introduced me quickly, almost like a formality. "This is my mom." They smiled politely, then turned back to their conversations. I sat quietly, taking it in, waiting for my moment. When one of his coworkers asked about his background, about how he managed to make it on his own, I leaned forward a little, expecting to hear something, anything that tied back to the years we spent together, to the sacrifices that carried him there. I wanted him to say, "My mom worked hard. She gave up so much. I wouldn't be here without her." Instead, Ethan smiled in that polished, proud way and said, "Honestly, I've just always hustled. Built it all from scratch. No one handed me anything." The words hung in the air like a knife above my head. My chest went tight. My breath caught. For a second, I thought I'd misheard. No one handed him anything? I remembered the jar of coins hidden in the pantry, the double shifts, the nights I went without dinner so he could have lunch money, the shoes I patched until they nearly fell apart so he could have new cleats. No one handed him anything? I stared at him, willing his eyes to meet mine, to take it back, to notice the silence that settled like ash across the table. But he didn't look. He kept talking, kept smiling, painting himself as self-made, untouched, as if the foundation under his feet hadn't been poured with my blood and years. One of his friends raised a glass, to Ethan, self-made man. They clinked and cheered. My hands stayed in my lap. My throat burned. I pressed my napkin to my mouth, not to eat, but to keep the sob from escaping. It wasn't just the denial, It was the rewriting, the erasure. In that single sentence, he didn't just forget me, he erased me. My story, my labor, my sacrifices, all gone. It was as if I had never existed. I tried to swallow it down. I told myself, don't make a scene. Don't embarrass him. But my heart cracked so loudly inside me it felt like the whole restaurant must hear. When the waiter asked if I'd like dessert, I shook my head. Ethan laughed. Mom's always been frugal. As if that word, frugal, could capture decades of sacrifice. As if my entire life could be reduced to a punchline. They laughed with him, not knowing that frugal meant I'd missed meals, ignored medical bills, pawned my wedding ring once just to keep the lights on. I excused myself to the restroom, hands trembling, face pale. I locked myself in a stall and pressed my palms to my cheeks, whispering, "Stay strong, stay quiet, just get through it." But the tears slid anyway, silent, hot, bitter. When I came back, the check was already on the table. Ethan handed over his card with a flourish. "I've got it, no worries." Another performance. A chance to show his friends he was generous, successful, independent. No one knew that just 10 years earlier he'd called me from a payphone, crying because he couldn't cover rent, and I'd drained my hidden savings to help him. He didn't mention that part. He never would. We walked to the parking lot. He kissed my cheek, quick, distracted, already scrolling through his phone. "Thanks for coming, Mom. They liked you." I forced a smile, my body hollow, my heart raw. I nodded, whispered, "Of course." He didn't notice the way my voice cracked. Driving home that night, the road blurred through my tears. Streetlights smeared across the windshield. I gripped the wheel tight, repeating his words over and over. No one handed me anything. It was then I realized something I had refused to admit until now. Love does not guarantee gratitude. Sacrifice does not guarantee respect. And sometimes the very people you pour yourself into will pour you right back out, as if you were nothing more than a vessel, a tool, a step they outgrew. That night, lying in bed, I stared at the ceiling and felt the weight of it all pressing down. He hadn't just denied my sacrifices, he had denied me, the person who gave him life, who raised him, who made him possible. In front of others, he erased me completely. It's one thing to be forgotten. It's another to be rewritten. And that, I realized, was the cruelest denial of all. I should have known the denial wasn't the end of it. When someone erases you with their words, it's only a matter of time before their actions follow. And actions, small, sharp, almost invisible to outsiders, are what cut the deepest. It was Ethan's idea to host the memorial dinner for my late husband. I thought it was kind, thoughtful, maybe a step toward softening the distance that had grown between us. I arrived early carrying a tray of deviled eggs, the way I always had for family gatherings. My hands shook as I set them down on the counter, but I told myself this was what healing looked like. Showing up, staying steady, refusing to give up on your own child. When the guests started filling the living room, I found myself lingering near the edge of the couch, waiting for Ethan to notice me, to pull me close. Instead, Jessica slid into the center, arranging platters, calling instructions, directing the evening like she'd been born the matriarch. I didn't mind. It's natural for the young to step forward. But what hurt was how easily my presence dissolved into the wallpaper. The first cut was subtle. I moved to take a seat near the dining table, but Jessica looked at me, smiled that tight smile, and guided me toward a chair in the corner. "Why don't you take this one, Mom? It's quieter." The chair wobbled under me, one leg shorter than the others. No one else seemed to notice. I folded my hands in my lap, praying no one would see the flush rising in my cheeks. Later, when the food was served, I filled a small plate, just enough to keep me busy. Ethan walked by, laughing with a cousin, and in his rush, he nudged my arm. My fork clattered, my plate tipped, and the little mound of food I had carefully scooped slid onto the floor. For a moment, the room went silent, everyone pretending not to see, until Jessica bent down, scooped the plate from my lap, and said, "Oh, let's give this to someone else." before disappearing into the kitchen. I sat there, empty-handed, staring at my napkin as if it could save me. It wasn't about the food, it was about being displaced, as though my hunger, my presence didn't matter. I had been set aside, not cruelly enough for anyone to call it out, but quietly enough that the humiliation pulsed in my chest. When the toasts began, Ethan raised his glass to his father, telling stories that sparkled with his charm. Everyone laughed, everyone nodded, and I waited, holding my breath, certain he would mention me. How I held that man's hand through every doctor's appointment, how I worked nights to pay for the treatments, how I kept the house running while grief hollowed me out. But my name never came. Not once. Instead, Ethan praised Jessica, thanked her for organizing the evening, called her his rock. The room applauded. My eyes stung, but I forced my lips into a smile, afraid that if I didn't, the truth of my pain would spill out for everyone to see. Later, I tried to offer a gift. I had brought a framed photo, Ethan as a child sitting on his father's shoulders at the county fair. It was one of my favorites, proof that once upon a time, we had been whole. I handed it to him quietly, a piece of memory wrapped in glass. He looked at it, nodded absently, and set it face down on a side table. Hours passed, and it stayed there, forgotten, hidden beneath a pile of paper napkins and used cups. That night, I drove home with my chest hollowed out. The road stretched dark, my headlights cutting thin lines into the night. I thought about the chair, the plate, the photo. All tiny moments, small enough that someone else might shrug them off. But to me, they felt like deliberate steps, each one pushing me further outside the circle. Humiliation doesn't always come with laughter or jeers. Sometimes it comes with polite smiles, with careful redirections, with a kindness so sharp it carves you clean out of your own family. That night I understood. I wasn't just being ignored. I was being replaced. At home, I set my purse on the counter, walked into the bedroom, and sat down on the edge of my bed. My body ached with a weariness deeper than age. I wanted to scream, to call him, to demand, "Don't you see me? Don't you remember who I am?" But I knew the answer. He didn't. Or worse, he did, and it didn't matter. I pressed the heels of my hands to my eyes and tried to breathe, but every inhale burned. I had lived my life believing in the dignity of silence, of sacrifice, of enduring without complaint. But in that moment, silence felt like consent. And humiliation, I realized, was becoming my language in that house. Some betrayals are loud. Mine was quiet, made up of small humiliations stacked one upon another until I was buried beneath them. And though I didn't know it then, the day was coming when the quiet would end. The day was coming when my silence would not be humiliation anymore, but armor. It was my granddaughter's birthday. The kind of milestone I'd always imagined celebrating shoulder to shoulder with family, a place set for me at the table, laughter mixing with frosting and candles. For days beforehand, I baked cookies, wrapped a soft pink sweater I'd saved up for, and told myself this would be the moment things felt different. Surely, at a child's birthday, even the hardest hearts would soften. When I walked through the door, balloons tangled in the light, children running with party hats, I was greeted with quick smiles, a distracted hug from Ethan, and Jessica telling me, "Just put your things over there." I obeyed, setting the gift on a crowded table, standing for a second too long as if waiting for someone to notice I was trembling. Then, as the kids lined up for pictures, Jessica called out, "Mom, come join the family shot." My chest filled so suddenly I thought I might cry right there. At last, an acknowledgement, an invitation. I stepped forward, adjusting my blouse, smoothing my hair, moving toward the spot beside Ethan. The photographer lifted the camera. My heart pounded with relief. Maybe, finally, I still had a place here. But just as I reached the group, Jessica's hand touched my elbow, light but firm. "Actually, could you step aside just for 1 second? We're going to get the immediate family first." She smiled as if she hadn't just pulled the floor from under me. Immediate family. The words hit harder than any slap. In one sentence, I was out. I stepped back, frozen, while they rearranged themselves. Jessica slid into the space I had aimed for. Ethan held his daughter on his hip, grinning at the camera, his arm draped around his wife. Snap, snap. My granddaughter giggled. And me? I stood on the edge, holding my purse like it could anchor me, invisible in plain sight. After the photos, no one called me back in. No one said, "Your turn, Mom." The children ran to cake and gifts, the adults followed, and I drifted toward a chair in the corner, the same kind of chair they always seemed to give me. Out of sight, out of mind. When it was time for gifts, mine was opened with barely a glance. My granddaughter smiled at the sweater, pulled it over her head, then tossed it aside for a box of plastic toys. Ethan laughed at the toys. Jessica clapped, and my little offering slid into the pile like an afterthought. I clapped too, of course. I clapped until my palms stung, because what else can you do when your love is treated like clutter? Later, as everyone sang happy birthday, I stood in the back, watching candles flicker against faces that seemed to belong to a world I no longer occupied. I whispered the words instead of singing, afraid my voice would crack. When the wish was made and the cake sliced, I wasn't asked if I wanted a piece. By the time I wandered toward the kitchen, the plates were already licked clean, the frosting gone. On the drive home, I gripped the steering wheel so hard my knuckles ached. Over and over, I replayed the moment Jessica's hand touched my arm. That tiny gesture, that gentle redirection, was louder than any argument. It said, "You don't belong here. You are not family anymore." That night, lying awake, I thought about how hope is the cruelest trick. The small lift you feel when they finally call your name, only to be shoved back into the shadows. It cuts deeper than outright rejection. If they had ignored me from the start, maybe I could have built armor. But no, they pulled me in, dangled the promise of recognition, then snatched it away. That's what makes the wound bleed longer. And I couldn't stop asking myself, why did I let my heart leap so quickly? Why did I still crave a place in pictures that no one would frame? I remembered the photo I had brought at the memorial, the one left face down under napkins. Now this birthday picture would hang on their wall, a smiling family of 4 while I stood somewhere just beyond the border, erased once again. The truth is, humiliation wrapped in celebration hurts worse. It makes you doubt your own reality. Did that really happen? Was I really pushed aside? Or am I just too sensitive, too desperate for something they never planned to give? But I know what I felt. I felt the burn in my chest when Jessica said, "immediate family." I felt the sting of Ethan's silence, and I felt the ache of knowing I was a ghost at my own granddaughter's party. It was on that drive home, headlights carving through the dark, that I finally admitted to myself, this wasn't just distance. This was deliberate. I wasn't forgotten by accident. I was being erased on purpose. And once you see that truth, you can't unsee it. I used to think loneliness was an empty house, the silence of 4 walls. But true isolation, the kind that breaks you, doesn't come from being alone. It comes from being cut out while life goes on without you, while the people you love gather just beyond reach and never think to open the door. It started with the family group chat. My phone buzzed less and less until one day it simply stopped. When I opened the app, there was no new thread, no pictures of the kids, no reminders for holidays. I thought maybe it was quiet for everyone, until I overheard at church that Jessica had shared photos of their trip to Florida. The kind of photos that used to brighten my days. I scrolled and scrolled, but on my phone, there was nothing. My name had been removed, not by accident, by choice. Holidays were next. Thanksgiving came and went. I baked a pumpkin pie anyway, just in case the phone rang. I left it cooling on the counter like a candle waiting to be lit. No one called. I sat down at my kitchen table, fork in hand, and ate the pie alone, each bite heavier than the last. I told myself maybe they had gone to Jessica's family that year. Surely Christmas would be different. But December 25th arrived, and my doorbell never rang. I watched neighbors carry bags of gifts inside, children laughing, lights blinking in every window but mine. I started to feel like I'd been erased, not just from their home, but from their lives. The mailbox didn't bring invitations anymore. The phone didn't carry their voices. My name wasn't on the list for the school recital, even though I once sewed every costume for Ethan's plays. The sharpest cut came when I learned, weeks later, that my granddaughter had been in the hospital for a minor surgery. I hadn't known. Nobody called. Nobody asked me to sit in the waiting room, to hold a hand, to pray. By the time I found out, she was already home, recovering, surrounded by everyone but me. I sat in my bedroom that night, clutching an old teddy bear Ethan once loved, and cried so hard I thought my chest might split. And it wasn't just the big moments. It was the small things, too. Not being on the emergency contact forms at school. Not being listed as a babysitter option. Not being asked to bring a dish for a family cookout. My identity as mother, grandmother, matriarch, it was being peeled away layer by layer until I was no one. I kept asking myself, what did I do wrong? Was I too clingy, too soft, too giving? Or was that just the excuse they told themselves while they erased me? Because deep down, I knew I had given them everything. There was nothing left to take, and still they wanted more. My silence, my absence, my permission to pretend I never mattered. There were nights when the quiet was so thick it pressed against my ears. I would sit by the window, staring at the glow of their house across town, wondering if they were laughing, if they were telling stories, if anyone there ever said my name. Sometimes I imagined walking up to their front door, ringing the bell, demanding answers. But then I pictured Jessica's smile, polite and sharp, and Ethan's distracted hug, and the way they would say, "Oh, Mom, we didn't think you'd want to come," and I knew the humiliation would be worse than the silence. That's the cruel thing about isolation. It teaches you to exile yourself before anyone else has to. And now let me ask you something, from one soul to another. Have you ever felt that sting of being forgotten on purpose? Not by fate, not by chance, but by the very people you thought would never shut you out? Because if you have, you know the silence is louder than any argument. You know it cuts deeper than words. I tried to find small comforts, a walk around the block, a trip to the library. I checked out novels I never finished because my eyes blurred after 2 pages. I joined the ladies' circle at church, but their chatter about grandchildren's milestones only deepened the ache. I smiled, nodded, and carried my loneliness home like a secret I was ashamed of. The worst part was how invisible I became to myself. Without invitations, without inclusion, I started to believe I didn't matter. My days blurred into sameness. Coffee, dishes, silence, sleep. Sometimes I didn't even turn on the lights in the evening, just sat in the dark, waiting for a reason to move. When the phone finally rang one afternoon, my heart leapt. But it wasn't Ethan. It was the bank reminding me of a payment due. I thanked the man on the line longer than necessary, just for the sound of another voice. That night, I stood in the kitchen, piecing together leftovers, and realized this was my life now. A ghost in my own family, unseen, unheard, erased. And I couldn't decide which was worse. The fact that they had cut me out, or the fact that they didn't even notice what they had done. I had once believed that family was forever, that love was unbreakable. But standing in that kitchen, listening to the hum of the refrigerator, I began to understand forever can end quietly. Not with a fight, not with a goodbye, but with nothing at all. There's a kind of loss no one brings flowers for. It doesn't happen in a hospital room or a funeral home. It happens quietly in living rooms and hallways when you realize the traces of your life have been swept away as if you were never there. I noticed it first when I came by Ethan's house to drop off a pan of lasagna. I hadn't been invited, but the urge to do something motherly overpowered my hesitation. I knocked, expecting awkwardness, but Jessica answered with that frozen smile. She accepted the food with a quick thanks and told me they were just heading out. Behind her shoulder, I caught a glimpse of the mantel, the photo that used to sit there, our family portrait taken when Ethan was 10, his arm around me, both of us grinning under the county fair lights, was gone. In its place stood a sleek silver frame, with Ethan, Jessica, and the kids, dressed in matching blues, posed in front of the ocean. I stood there long enough for Jessica to clear her throat. The message was clear. The old picture had no place in their new life. I told myself maybe it was just moved, as maybe it was in a drawer or waiting for another frame. But deep down, I knew. My image had been replaced. Back home, I looked around my own walls. They were still covered with Ethan's school photos, the lopsided painting he'd made in 2nd grade, the clay mug with Mom scratched into the side. My house was a museum of him, but in his house, I had become a ghost. The next loss came when I searched for the old watch my husband had worn every day. I had given it to Ethan after the funeral, telling him, "This belonged to your father. Keep it close." It was supposed to be the bridge between past and present, the reminder that we had built something together. One evening, while visiting, I asked casually if he still had it. Ethan looked puzzled. "Which watch?" he asked, as if it were nothing more than a trinket. Jessica answered for him. "Oh, I think we donated that a while back. It didn't work anymore." Donated. My husband's watch. The piece of him I had held onto like a lifeline. I smiled to hide the crack in my chest, nodded and said, "Oh, that's fine." But in the car afterward, I gripped the steering wheel so tight my knuckles ached. Donated. As if his memory, our history, could be tossed in a bin with old sweaters and chipped mugs. I began to understand that I wasn't just being left out. I was being erased. Every photo, every object, every reminder of me was quietly disappearing from their world. And the worst part? No one thought I'd notice. At church one Sunday, someone asked me if I'd seen the new family newsletter Ethan's office had published. I hadn't. They showed me a glossy spread, an article about Ethan's success, complete with photos of his family. The caption read, "Ethan Collins, devoted husband and father." No mention of the woman who raised him, who sacrificed her entire life so he could stand where he stood. My name wasn't even a footnote. That night, I sat at my kitchen table, staring at the newsletter until the letters blurred. I thought about the photo on the mantel, the missing watch, the words in print that rewrote him as if I had never existed. And it struck me that this was worse than death. At least in death, people remember you. At least in death, you get flowers. This was a living burial. The unseen loss is the cruelest because there's no ceremony to mark it, no moment to say goodbye. You just wake up one day and realize the evidence of your love, your labor, your existence has been swept clean. I walked into my bedroom, opened the drawer where I keep the letters Ethan had written me from college. Short, hurried notes asking for money or food. They weren't sentimental, but they were proof I had mattered. Proof that once he had needed me. I pressed them to my chest and wept, the paper damp under my tears. And I kept thinking, if the world can erase you from the walls, from the stories, from the heirlooms, does that mean you were never really there? Or does it mean they are terrified of remembering how much they owe you? That's what burned the most. Not just the absence, but the deliberate nature of it. It wasn't that they forgot. It was that they chose to remove me. Piece by piece, they built a world where I was unnecessary, inconvenient, invisible. I realized then that isolation is one thing, being cut off from the present. But unseen loss is another. It is being cut out of the past, too. It's not just that they don't call you anymore. It's that they pretend you never mattered in the first place. The night ended with me sitting in the dark, the old letters spread across my lap, whispering to myself that I was real, that I was here, that I had given everything. No photograph, no watch, no article could take that away. But still, the ache lingered. Because the truth is, when your legacy is erased, it feels like your very soul is gone with it. There's only so much a heart can hold before it splinters. For months, maybe years, I told myself to swallow the silence, to smile through the humiliation, to pretend the erasures weren't deliberate. But the night of that family gathering, the dam finally cracked. And it didn't crack in private. It cracked in front of everyone. It was a reunion at Ethan's house, one of those evenings when distant cousins show up with casserole dishes and beer, kids running barefoot in the yard, adults swapping stories about work and the price of gas. I arrived with a peach cobbler still warm, the sugar crust golden, just the way Ethan used to like it. My hands shook slightly as I carried it in, but I smiled, hopeful that maybe this time would be different. The kitchen was crowded, laughter spilling over the counters. I set the dish down and waited for Ethan to notice. He glanced at me, gave a quick nod, and turned back to his conversation. My offering sat untouched, while store-bought pies disappeared slice by slice. I took a seat in the living room, perching on the edge of the couch, hands folded, trying to blend into the noise. For a moment, I let myself drift in the sound of family, voices layered like music, the clink of glasses, the thud of kids on the stairs. Then Ethan's voice cut through. "Honestly," he said, loud enough for the room to hear, "I don't know what I'd do if I didn't have Jessica. She keeps everything together. Without her, I'd be lost." The crowd applauded lightly. Someone raised a glass. My throat tightened. I told myself not to be petty. But then he added, almost offhand, "Before Jessica, I was basically on my own." On my own. The words hit like a hammer. On his own? Had I imagined the decades of sacrifice? The nights I worked overtime, the meals I skipped, the dreams I buried just to keep him afloat? I sat frozen, my cobbler untouched in the kitchen, while people clapped for Jessica, the savior of his story. Not once did his eyes flicker to me. Not once did he acknowledge that I had kept him alive, fed, clothed, educated, standing on 2 feet long before Jessica ever came into the picture. And then it happened. A cousin asked about college. Ethan leaned back in his chair, smirked, and said, "Yeah, that was rough, but I figured it out. No help, just me grinding it out." Laughter. Nods. Admiration. The room spun. My chest clenched. I tried to speak, to remind him, to say, "Who wrote the checks for your tuition? Who pawned her wedding ring to cover your rent?" But no words came. My voice, like everything else, had been erased. Then, as if the universe wanted to twist the knife, someone called for more chairs. Jessica turned to me. "Mom, could you grab the folding one in the garage? You'll be fine with that, right?" I rose, cheeks burning, and fetched the chair. When I returned, I unfolded it in the corner. It creaked under my weight, unsteady, as the rest of the family sat at the table on sturdy seats, laughing. I balanced there, small, shaky, forgotten. At dinner, plates were passed around, but when they reached me, the bowl was nearly empty. Just scraps of salad, a spoonful of potatoes. I smiled, pretended it was enough while everyone else dug into heaping portions. And then the final blow. As conversation swirled, Ethan turned toward me, his voice cutting across the room. "Mom, you should probably just relax now. Don't worry about all this. We've got it covered." It was meant to sound kind, but it landed like a dismissal. Relax now? As if my usefulness had expired, as if my decades of sacrifice, my role as mother, as backbone, meant nothing. The room went silent for a moment, then laughter filled the gap. They didn't notice the way my hands shook, or how I pressed my napkin to my lips to stop them from trembling. That was my breaking point. Not a scream, not a fight, just the quiet realization that I had been stripped down to nothing in the eyes of the very boy I'd given everything to. I sat there, surrounded by people, and felt more alone than I had ever felt in my life. Driving home that night, the cobbler still in my back seat, untouched, I gripped the wheel until my knuckles whitened. Streetlights flickered across the windshield, each one a reminder of how invisible I had become. I thought about turning around, walking back in, and demanding, "Look at me, see me, say my name." But I knew it wouldn't matter. Recognition offered under duress isn't recognition at all. It's pity. And I was done begging for scraps. That night, I cried until my pillow was damp, then stared at the ceiling in silence. Something inside me shifted. The grief was still there, but beneath it, a new layer formed. Harder, colder, stronger. Because once your heart breaks all the way, it doesn't shatter into dust. It sharpens into glass. And I knew, as I lay there in the dark, that I could no longer keep pretending. The woman who gave everything had finally broken, and out of that break, something new was going to rise. I didn't plan to run into Helen. I had dragged myself to the little cafe in town just to sit among voices, to hear the clatter of dishes instead of the silence of my own kitchen. I ordered coffee I didn't really want, more for the weight of the mug in my hands than the taste. And then I heard her call my name. Helen had been my neighbor years ago, before she moved to a smaller place after her husband passed. She was older now, lines deeper around her eyes, but her smile was steady. She slid into the chair across from me before I could protest. We talked about the weather, about church, about nothing. But she studied me too closely, and finally she said, "Maggie, you look worn down. What's going on?" For a moment, I thought about lying, about saying I was fine, just tired, but the words spilled out like water breaking through a dam. I told her about the birthday party, the picture I'd been pushed out of. I told her about the watch that had been donated, the photo on the mantle that had disappeared, the way Ethan introduced himself as self-made. I confessed how invisible I had become. Helen didn't look shocked. She just nodded slowly as if she had seen this kind of thing before. When I finished, she leaned in, her voice low and certain. "You gave him everything and now he believes he owes you nothing. But Maggie, you can't keep begging for scraps of recognition. You don't need them to see your worth for it to be real." Her words hit me harder than any insult I'd heard at Ethan's house. For so long, I had been clinging to the hope that one day he'd wake up, remember, apologize, thank me. But what if that day never came? Could I live without it? Could I carry my value without waiting for him to hand it back to me? I looked down at my hands, the same hands that had sewn his clothes, cooked his meals, signed every school permission slip. They were wrinkled now, but they were mine. They told the story of a woman who had done more than enough. Helen touched my wrist gently. "You can still choose yourself, Maggie. That's not betrayal. That's survival." On the walk home, her words echoed in my head, louder with every step. Maybe I had been waiting for recognition that was never coming. Maybe the only person left to see me was me. And let me ask you this. If someone told you the truth you'd been too afraid to face, would you listen? Or would you turn away and keep waiting for something that might never arrive? That evening, I sat in my quiet kitchen and whispered to myself, "I see you." It felt strange at first, almost foolish, but then a calm settled over me. For the first time in years, I wasn't waiting for Ethan's approval, Jessica's smile, or anyone else's acknowledgement. I was waiting for my own. And that, I realized, was the first step towards something I hadn't felt in a long time: freedom. The realization settled in like a quiet dawn. After Helen's words, I couldn't go back to waiting by the phone or hoping for a seat at the table. Something inside me had shifted, and though the ache was still raw, it carried with it a strange kind of clarity. I didn't need to shout or argue. I didn't need to beg for space. I only needed to decide, silently, firmly, that I would no longer stand where I wasn't wanted. That evening, I opened the closet and pulled out an old suitcase, the same one I'd used decades ago when I first left home as a young bride. My hands shook as I unzipped it, not with fear, but with the weight of what I was finally choosing. I'd began placing small things inside, a sweater I loved but rarely wore, a photo of me and my husband before the sickness, a cookbook with notes in the margins. Nothing extravagant, just pieces of myself I wasn't willing to leave behind. The house around me seemed to watch. Every corner carried the echo of sacrifices made, meals cooked, bills paid, nights spent stitching instead of sleeping. But now those echoes felt different. They no longer bound me. They reminded me that I had given enough, more than enough. I didn't leave a note for Ethan. What could I possibly write that would make him see me after all these years of not seeing? Words had failed too many times already. Silence, I realized, would speak louder than any letter. The next morning I woke early, made coffee, and sat at the kitchen table one last time. Sunlight streamed through the curtains, catching the dust in the air like tiny stars. I breathed it in, memorized it, then stood and carried my bag to the door. For the first time in years, I felt light. Not happy, not yet, but free. Free from waiting for recognition that would never come. Free from humiliation disguised as kindness. Free from the endless cycle of hope and hurt. I locked the door, slipped the key into my purse, and walked down the front steps. My footsteps were steady, not rushed, not hesitant. Each one felt like a promise to myself. You are choosing your own life now. No one knew. No one stopped me. And strangely, that felt right. This wasn't a decision for them to witness. It was mine alone, a quiet rebellion, a reclaiming of self that required no audience. Sometimes people think strength is loud, all fire and fury. But I learned that strength can also be silent, packing a bag, closing a door, walking away without fanfare. Because real strength isn't about proving others wrong. It's about finally refusing to betray yourself. That night, I lay in a small rented room with bare walls and a single lamp. It wasn't much, but it was mine. For the first time in decades, I wasn't surrounded by reminders of what I'd lost. Instead, I was surrounded by possibility. And as I drifted to sleep, I whispered the words I had been too afraid to say aloud. I choose me now. The room I rented near the water was small, no bigger than Ethan's pantry, but it was mine. 4 walls, a narrow window facing the bay, a second-hand bed with a quilt that smelled faintly of lavender. For the first time in years, I stepped into a space not built around anyone else's needs. There was no place set aside for me. The whole room was mine. The first morning, I rose with the sun. I made coffee in a chipped mug I'd bought from the thrift store and sat by the window watching the light creep across the floor. The silence was different here, not the heavy silence of exclusion, but the gentle kind that let me breathe. I walked to the corner store and bought flowers, yellow daisies, nothing fancy. I put them in a jar on the table and the room shifted. Just like that, it felt alive. Later that week, I found a fabric shop downtown. Bolts of color lined the walls, bright blues and deep reds, patterns that stirred something in me I thought I'd buried long ago. I bought a few yards of cloth, took them home, and set up a small sewing machine by the window. My fingers remembered the rhythm. The needle clicked. The fabric fed beneath my hands, and piece by piece I began making things. Not for Ethan, not for Jessica, not for anyone else. For me. A dress in a shade of green I'd once loved but never worn. A quilt with wild colors that would have been too much for their neat home. Each stitch felt like a declaration. I am still here. In the evenings, I walked along the beach, the tide brushing against the sand. Sometimes I collected shells, sometimes I simply let the wind wash through me. No one asked where I had been, no one questioned why I stayed out late. The freedom was quiet, but it was real. Neighbors began to notice me. A woman from down the hall knocked one afternoon with extra soup. We talked about nothing important, recipes, the weather, the sound of gulls, but it felt like connection, soft and easy. For once, I wasn't shrinking to fit someone else's comfort. I was just me, and that was enough. I didn't cut ties completely. Every so often, I checked my phone, saw missed calls from unknown numbers, messages from church friends who wondered where I'd gone. But not from Ethan. Not once. At first, the silence stung. Then, slowly, it stopped mattering. I no longer waited for it. One night, I pulled on the green dress I'd sewn and stood in front of the mirror. The fabric hugged my body gently. The color lit my tired eyes. I smiled, not for anyone else's approval, but for mine. It wasn't revenge. It wasn't triumph. It was simply life, returning in small, steady breaths. I had been erased from one world, but here, in this quiet corner, I was painting a new one, stitch by stitch, step by step, and though no one else knew it, I was being born again. The morning was warm, the kind of sunlight that doesn't burn but blesses. I carried a small box down to the shore, my feet sinking into the damp sand with every step. Inside were the pieces I had held onto too tightly. A ribbon from Ethan's first spelling bee, a faded photograph from the fair, a birthday card I had once tucked into his lunchbox. Tiny artifacts of a life I had built for him, each one proof that I existed in those years, even if his memory no longer allowed me space. I stood at the water's edge for a long time, the tide brushing close, then retreating as if asking permission. My heart was heavy, but not in the same way it had been before. This heaviness was different. It was the weight of release. I opened the box and picked up the card. His little boy handwriting was crooked, letters backward in places. "Love you, Mom." I pressed it to my chest one last time, then let it fall into the water. The tide caught it and carried it away, soft and certain. One by one, I dropped the rest of the keepsakes, watching the waves pull them into a place I could no longer reach. I didn't cry. My eyes stayed clear, fixed on the horizon. For the first time, I wasn't begging the past to stay. I was telling it goodbye. When the box was empty, I sat on the sand and pulled out my notebook. The pages were filled with small notes I had written to myself in recent weeks, reminders that I mattered, fragments of healing. On the last page, I wrote the words that had been circling in my chest for months. I don't need anyone to see me anymore. I see me. I recognize me. I am enough. I closed the notebook, tucked it under my arm, and stood. Behind me, the world I had built and lost. Before me, the endless ocean, wide and waiting. I stepped forward into the sunlight, the warmth settling across my shoulders like a blessing I had finally given myself. It wasn't victory in the way people imagine revenge. There was no confrontation, no applause. It was quieter than that, softer but stronger. It was the freedom of no longer needing to be recognized by those who chose not to. And maybe that's the truest kind of justice, to rise. Not because they finally see your worth, but because you finally do. Now let me ask you, if it were you standing there, holding pieces of a life that others tried to erase, would you cling tighter? Or would you let the tide take them and walk forward free?